Okay, Hikaru with the white pieces this time plays d4, bishop g5, the trump house key. How does black deal with this? He plays c5, hits the bishop, and now the bishop goes to f4. So we have some potential of a Benoni structure, potential of a Banco structure. Let's see how black plays this. He can play um, e6 here. Does he go g6? Does he go b5? Many options for black. So he goes g6, bishop g7, queen d2, stopping black from castling. g5, bishop g3. Now knight h5 can win the bishop pair. Hikaru plays e3, covering some d4 squares. Bishop d3. Wonder if knight e5. What does white do with the bishop? He doesn't play it. We'll check afterwards. e6, e4. If you take, how does white take back? He takes back with a c pawn, keeping his pawn chain on the king side connected. g4 stops black from playing g4 and gives white this nice square on f5. Rook to e8 is a move. a6, a4, queen a5 threatens b5. You could play rook a3 here or rook a2. Knight e7, play knight e2. And what to do here? Just castles, allowing black to trade if he wants the light squared bishop. f5 is stopped, which is one of black's main pawn breaks here, and pawn b5 cannot be played. So I think black is going to have to play like queen c7. It goes forwards and threatens b5. What a strong idea. The queen on d2 is also hanging, so the knight on c3 doesn't actually cover the b5 square. So Hikaru defends the queen preemptively. And now b5, you can take twice, and it works out for white. He plays it anyways, recognizing the bishop on d3 was hanging in some variation. Unfortunately for black, the queen on b4 stops black's pawn from moving to b4. He can play pawn c4 here. He decides to trade queens. You don't have to take it. You could play queen f2. Now the rook hits the queen. You could trade here or go back to b4. He decides to trade and take, which is very surprising. I thought maybe pawn c4 could be played. Now the pawns on the queen side are a bit weak. Knight f5 hits the bishop on g7. More importantly, the pawn on d6. And I'm trying to share everything really fast here, but could also slow down as well. The pawn on b2 is a little bit weak. I expect rook d2 to be played before rook takes on a4. Goes king g3. Kind of a surprising concept. Hikaru keeps his knight on the board, seeing that the black knight on f6 is not potentially as powerful as a knight coming to d3. So takes knight d3 maybe. Covering the second rank, not allowing black to get activity. You can learn a lot from the way Hikaru plays. Okay, you can take, and the knight covers the h1 square. Maybe that was missed by black. Now the g3 square is safe, so this doesn't create a threat. Knight takes. The bishop blocked the rook from attacking. Okay, so the d6 pawn is going to fall. You have a check. There looks like to be some idea, but now the pieces are a little bit uncoordinated for white. Knight to b5. This drops a piece, and black has a nice advantage. Mate was threatened. Check. King has to go to h0, h1. Pawn is threatened. You could play f4 here. Now he can play rook g2. King g7 is played. Takes. And black is for choice here. So black trying to find the right way to convert this, rerouting the knight and trading off the rooks. And Hikaru is thinking he can't really trade rooks here, it's lost, so he gives away material, trying to keep the game going. The knight could take this pawn here. He could give a check. and Hikaru resigns the game. Okay, so this is one of the games Hikaru loses, which is rare, but happens maybe one every 5 or so games against, maybe one every 3 games against this level of opponent. Let's go to our analysis and understand why. Hikaru is white, plays pawn d4, knight f6, let's turn the engine on, bishop g5. The Trumpowski. Black's response to this is pawn c5, white plays d5, and pawn to h6. White would have a advantage according to the computer with bishop takes, pawn takes, and e4, but maybe he didn't want to go into this structure where black has the dark squared bishop. So Hikaru plays bishop f4, bishop f4, black plays d6, pawn c4, pawn g6, knight c3, bishop g7, and queen d2, temporarily stopping black from castling because the h6 pawn would fall. Pawn to g5 is played, solving that problem, and after bishop g3, knight h5, going after the bishop pair. e3 is played, covering some dark squares in the position, not pawn to e4 immediately. Maybe one day you can go for f4 potentially. Interesting idea that he plays just e3, covering some squares rather than what would look like a more natural move like e4. But this does give away some important squares with bishop d4 later in the game, and the f4 square as well. Bishop d3 takes, and knight to f6. I was wondering what would happen after knight to e5, which is the top engine move, and the bishop would just slide back to e2. Knight to f6 is played. Hikaru plays pawn to f3. He sees he has some potential weakness with this f3 and g4 square. Maybe g4 is an idea here for black, restricting white's play. But then again, after g4, you can play knight e2, knight f4. So his choice to play f3 is quite interesting. And as we saw in the game, this was to establish control over the g4 and f5 squares. So he plays f3, the idea of g4, utilizing his extra pawns. This also fixes black's h6 pawn as well. f3, e6, breaking in the center, e4, takes, and takes with the c pawn. This is actually incorrect according to the engine. Better, it says to take with the e pawn. And after castles, knight to e2, pawn to a6, then pawn to g4. And the idea is to either establish the bishop or knight on f5. Let's say knight d7, knight g3, rook to e8, king to f1, knight to e5, and here maybe, okay, this pawn has to be defended, so a4 can be played. Takes on d5, castles, pawn g4, restricting this bishop. Black is actually slightly better here. He has the two bishops. The king is still stuck in the center, and he's trying to play for this b5 break, taking advantage that the rook is undefended. So white plays rook a2. After knight to d7, knight to e2, knight to e5, white castles. Bishop d7, knight g3, queen b4. Black is really not letting up this game, going for direct plan of b5. The knight is better than the knight on g3. The bishop is really dominant on this diagonal. It's going to jump into the game. And black plays b5. The queen was hanging, so b5 can't be played. B5 can be played here, but Hikaru tries to stop it with rook to d1. So let's say you play like a move like king h2, b5 can be played, and after takes, you can't take with the knight because queen takes. If you take with the bishop, it looks like you're holding, but actually bishop takes, and the queen can take back on b5 as well. We should trade rooks first. So tactically, black is able to get this b5 in move, and then you think Hikaru is stopping b5 because the queen is defended now, so you think b5 we can take with trade rooks first, take, and knight takes, But here it doesn't work at all because we can eliminate the defender of the knight with queen takes, rook takes, and knight takes d3. And they saw this idea almost instantaneously in the game. Black was able to achieve his pawn break on the queen side, grabbing space. Bishop goes to f1, queen goes to d4, queen goes to f2. Apparently, it was best to take on d4 and play knight to e2, targeting the pawn on d4 and claiming it's a weakness. In the game, queen f2 was played. Black trades the queens and opens up lines on the queen side. Initially, I thought this was a mistake, and the engine says it is a slight mistake. Black does have the advantage, but better was playing b4 here and pawn c4, establishing really strong pawns on the queen side. Okay, pawn takes, knight to f5, eliminate the strong knight. Now the e4 square is available for the white knight. Rook to b8, knight to e4, attacking this d6 pawn. Rook to d6, defending. King g3, knight d7. Black has a nice advantage. The bishop is great, the rook is great. The pawns are a bit weak, so it's surprising why the advantage is so strong. But for the moment, black is having a nice advantage. Rook d2, bishop e5, king h3, knight f6, and knight to f2, avoiding the trade. Rook to b8. If you take, then there's no more pressure on d6, and this bishop is really going to be a menace compared to the light squared bishop. The pawn on b2 will fall, and maybe black at some point can start pushing the c-pawn if the bishop isn't on this diagonal or the rook gets behind the pawn. Knight to f2, rook to b8, rook takes, and rook takes, and rook a2. He doesn't take on b2 and allow black to just completely dominate the second rank, which was possible because you can play knight d3 with a fork here, which was missed. But defensively, he prevents his opponent from covering some key ranks. In this case, the second rank, critical for white. So he controls it quite nicely. Rook takes, bishop takes a6. Better was a5, just holding on to the pawn. No reason to give away the pawn here, but black goes for more, attacking the bishop, which is a slight error. Bishop takes, bishop d4, g3, and knight takes d5. Quite a nice idea. The pawn on d5 is weak, and after bishop d4, you could play bishop c4 holding onto the pawn, which is possible. g3 is played. Knight takes, knight e4, knight e3, and knight e3 sets up some idea of rook h1, and the knight covers g2. Knight takes d6, rook b6, knight b5, which blunders a piece. So knight takes d6 is a pure blunder, and Hikaru is dealing with mating threats here. He sees the winning possibility of the pawn and misses the opponent's response with a rook b6. Knight to b5 and rook takes a6. The game goes on for a little while, but black has a really nice advantage here. He's up knight. Hikaru's trying to trade off some pawns. The knight is hit, and the rook hits the pawn. The king defends the pawn on g3. After king f6, king h3. Now black needs to trade off the rooks while attacking the g4 pawn. So in this position, how should we think as black? We want to convert this position. We could just be randomly moving the knight, but of course that's not good. So his plan here is to trade off white's rook on the fourth rank. At the same time, if you don't trade rooks, then the knight will find a way to attack this weak g4 pawn. After king g2, rook c3, the knight finds a way to attack the g4 pawn and control the c4 square. Really nice technique by black, winning a pawn, and it's game over from there.